Now let's talk about the difference between two types of arrays, two types of local arrays, static and automatic. Now, we already talked about static data containers, storage classes a little earlier. Static storage classes are basically are created and initialized at the time the program starts execution and continue to exist until the program terminates. Now, the variables that we have used so far were all local variables, meaning if a variable was created inside a function, that variable had a duration, a lifetime, only for as long as that function continued to execute. Once we return from a function, its local variables are lost, their contents are lost unless they are somehow returned by the function as a return value. Now, in this example, we're going to use, instead of just any storage class, we're going to use arrays. We can declare a local array as static by adding the static keyword in front of its definition. Now, having some storage classes, having some data structures static, has the benefit that, especially if they're local variables, has the benefit that they're not redefined every time the function is called. Those variables, those data structures more generally, are created once at the start of the program and will continue to exist until the program terminates. This is particularly important when we deal with arrays, especially if those arrays are large. Allocating memory to any variable takes a bit of time. If you can cut down on that time, that will make your program faster. Arrays require more memory, so especially if those arrays are large, that time can, in some cases, become significant. So declaring local arrays static can help you cut down or cut out that time. Another thing is that arrays that are declared static are automatically initialized to 0 at the time the program starts up. Remember that any other local variable has to be initialized explicitly, manually. So if you do not initialize a static array to anything, it will be initialized to 0 by default. And to see the difference between an automatic local array and a static local array, we're going to look at an example program. This program contains or uses two functions in its main function. One will be is called static array init, and the other one is called automatic array init. The static array init function, like the name says, defines a static array inside. The automatic array init function defines defines an automatic array, just a regular local array like we've been using up to this point. And what we're going to do is we're going to call each of these functions twice, and we're going to see the difference. What we're going to do is also we're not going to initialize the static array. we are going to demonstrate how declaring a static array automatically initializes its elements to 0 by not making any explicit initialization. The automatic array in the other function, in the automatic array init function, will be a local array and will have to be initialized before use. And we're going to initialize that to values 1, 2, and 3. Each function in the inside, what it does is it first prints out the values, the starting values in a sense, of its array. Then it's going to add 5 to each element of its array, and then going to print out the values again. Now, just because automatic local arrays are initialized to whatever's in the code every time does not mean that calling a function that contains a static array also initializes all elements of that array to 0 every time. That is a mistake. That's a misunderstanding. And here's the program I was talking about. So we have two function prototypes for static array init and automatic array init functions. They don't require any arguments, so arguments are void. They don't return any values, so return types are also set to void. And in the main function, simple enough, we're printing out a message, first call to each function, and then we call the static array init function once and the automatic array init function once, each for the first time. We print out another string just to make the output look nice, and then we call each of these functions a second time. So static array init called a second time, and automatic array init also called a second time. And that's it. That's all about the main function. Let's look inside these functions now. Let's look at the static array init function first. And like I said, it contains a local integer array, but this one is declared static. And that's the new part over here. The size of the array is 3. Inside this function, we're printing out first the values of the array that we're starting with. So this being a static array, we expect to see, the first time we call this function, we expect to see the values to be 0, 0, and 0. And that's what we accomplish in this for loop over here. The for loop goes from 0 to 2. Counter variable is I of size of type size underscore t, because we're using I as an index into array 1. And we have a printf statement in this for loop. We print out array 1, then the index number I, and then the value that's stored inside it, array 1 of I. Like I said, the first time we call this function, the values will be 0, 0, 0. Then we print out another string saying values on exiting static array init function, and we have another for loop, and in this for loop we are adding 5 to each element of array 1, and then we're printing it out just like we did over here in the first for loop. And when we do that, these elements should show up as 5, having values 5, 5, and 5 the first time we call this function. Now we already know what the main function looks like for this, what the main function looks like. Basically call the two functions twice. Now the second time we call this, remember this array 1 over here is declared static, which means the second time we call this function static array init, this array already exists and will retain its data values. Static data structures retain their values between function calls. So the second time we come around and we get into this first for loop again, we will see the last values of the array, which will be Last time we left it was 5, 5, and 5. So this for loop will show us 5, 5, and 5. And we do the same thing again. We get to the second for loop. We add 5 to each element of the array again. And on the second time, we call this function. This for loop will print out the values 10, 10, and 10. Then there's the other function, automatic array init. This one's considerably simpler, and actually there's nothing new in here. We declare a local array called array2 of size 3 and initialize its elements to 1, 2, and 3. Since this array is not a static array, C will not initialize its elements for us to anything. They'll remain garbage unless we do the initialization ourselves, which we are, of course, doing in line 45. The rest of the function is very similar in structure. We print out a string saying that we're printing out the initial values of this array. The initial values will, of course, be the first time we call this function. The initial values will be 1, 2, and 3 from here. The first time we call the function. Then we print out another string, and then we print out the elements of array 2 again, but this time, again, we add 5 to each element. So now we'll see 6, 7, and 8. Still the first time we're calling this function automatic array init. Now, the second time we call this function in the main function, we enter again, and remember the duration, the lifetime of array 2 is only the duration for which this function executes. So the second time we call this function, array 2 has to be recreated. And it will be reinitialized to the same values 1, 2, and 3. So when we call this function the second time, we again start off with values 1, 2, and 3 in the array, which means in the second for loop, we'll see the same output again, 6, 7, and 8. Both the first and the second time we call this function. And this is what the output will look like. So first call to each function, and this is the call to the static array init function. This is the second call to the static array init function. So I'll write that down. So static, first time, static, second time. And then we have over here the automatic array, the first time, and the automatic array calling the function the second time. So this goes with this goes with this. And you can see for the static array function, we start with values 0, 0, and 0. By the time we exit, those values are changed to 5, 5, and 5. The second time we call the function, we start off with the same values 5, 5, and 5. And we exit with 10, 10, and 10, 5 being added to each element in the second for loop. For the automatic array function, the elements are initialized to 1, 2, and 3. And then we add 5 to each of those elements, and we end up with 6, 7, and 8. We call the function a second time. And remember, because this function in a sense does not remember what the values of its local variables were the last time, recreates and reinitializes the array elements to 1, 2, and 3. And by the time we exit, We'll have added 5 to give us the same values again, 6, 7, and 8. So the values of a static data structure are remembered. The values of automatic variables data structures are forgotten.